I tell you, every week we get here, or get the opportunity to be here, is another week to be excited. And I wonder if that will ever stop. If there will be a weekend where, I hope it doesn't, where there will always be a reason to get excited. And, I've said this before, but if you wake up breathing, it's a good day. And so today is a good day that we get to be here as we continue to open God's Word and hear what it is that He has for us. And I love the opportunity to be able to share with you what that is. But even more so, it impacts me when I study what it is. If you've never had the opportunity to teach, I would suggest that you do. In fact, many of you have probably been in a situation where you've been able to teach the Bible. If you haven't, put yourself out there. Do a Bible study somewhere, bring people together, figure out what it would look like to teach, because what it ends up doing is it refines you, and it challenges you, and it pushes you. And so if I get up here and it has changed me in one bit, that's great. And if somehow it changes you, that's just a bonus, because God is continuing to refine me. And so we're starting a new series this week called Living Intentionally. We're going to be talking about what it means to be intentional in everything that we do. As we follow Jesus with the individuals that followed Him, we're going to go with Him from almost the beginning of His ministry all the way to Easter, to His triumphal entry, to when He died on the cross. And so we're going to follow Him from now until April 1st, which is Easter. And we're talking about the idea of being intentional, because one thing Jesus was intentional. Would that be a word that described you? If you were to pick a number of words, would intentional be one of them? And as I've been studying this, I can now tell you that that is not a word that would describe me. You can talk about planner. Yep, I'm definitely a planner. I think I'm pretty futuristic. I like being strategic. And then as I was studying, I looked at a number of different things that people suggested to be intentional, and there were a lot of lists and goals. And I am definitely a list and goal guy. In fact, as you read the blogs and all the studies about being intentional, you write lists to achieve goals. You set goals, so create lists to get to those goals, right? Yes, I am that guy. But what I have found is that doesn't mean I'm intentional. In fact, as I read a number of those things, I sat there going, creating goals and lists to accomplish those goals doesn't mean you're intentional. Because as I watched the Olympics this past week, how many people are into that? Yes. I've decided that I'm going to become eligible in 4 years for the Olympics. That is my new goal. All right, so 2022, here we come. I can do it. I mean, you watch how they've trained, and you can go into, doing anything you want, right? That verse, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Yeah, I will be an Olympic skier by 2022. Okay, probably not. But we can set goals and make lists to get us to where we want to be, but does that mean we're intentional? No. Intentional is every day doing what it is that you're supposed to be doing right where you're supposed to be. In fact, Webster defines intentional as on purpose, deliberate. So everything that we're doing, done on purpose, deliberate. Is it on purpose? Is it deliberate? And I can honestly say in my life the answer is no. It's not. In fact, I find myself doing all sorts of things that waste time, and I'm not intentionally doing it. In fact, my wife and I are kind of going back and forth, and I'm thankful she's not in here this morning because she's teaching Sunday school. Her way of wasting time is better than my way of wasting time, so we have this thing about whose way of wasting time is better, right? She is fine with her way of wasting time, but she looks down on my way of wasting time. And she's like, you could be more intentional with your time. And I said, well, you could be more intentional with your time. And she's like, I am. I'm like, well, I am too. I mean, if I get to the end of this video game, I was very intentional. I won. I conquered it. And if she reads every post on Facebook, she was intentional. She conquered it. But I find myself in that moment being convicted because I know that's not what I'm supposed to be doing, right? I should be putting that game down and sitting on the floor with my kids playing just one more game of Monopoly Deal for the 1,000th time. And yet I don't. And yet I should. But as we look at Jesus' life, he was intentional. But I'm going to make an argument that he was intentional for a very clear purpose, the same thing that we should be intentional with in our lives, and that is relationships. His life was focused on one thing very intentionally, and that was relationships. As we look at our world today, as I read all those blogs and I thought about all the goals and all the lists that you could create, you know how many were about relationships? None. None of them. Like I said, they're going, oh, that's kind of harsh, isn't it? That most of us in our lives go through life setting goals and accomplishing things and putting down lists to get to a place that have nothing to do with the people that are around us. So if I become a 2020 skier, what good is that going to do for the people that I love? In fact, as I thought about being intentional to be an Olympic skier, which I know it's kind of a joke, but in my mind it wasn't for a minute. I really was like, I think I can do this. How much time would I have to spend away from my family? I was reading a stat this week about Olympic skaters and what it takes to become a figure skater in the Olympics. It's something like 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, to the tune of like $35,000 a year to get the right coaches, the right choreography, the right skating places, all this stuff. And that was the top. But it didn't go down much farther from there. To be an Olympic skier, to be anything that's great, you've got to spend so much time doing it. Where are we putting our time and effort? And I look at Jesus because he did a great job with this. And so number one this morning is living intentionally is about relationships, and that was his focus. So open with me to Luke chapter 6, verses 12 through 16. Luke chapter 6, verses 12 through 16. If you don't have a Bible this morning, I'd love to give you one. There are a number on the back table there. If we run out back there, which would be great, we bought like 250 of them a couple weeks ago, but if they're gone, I'll give you this one. In fact, I'd love to give you this one if you need one to kind of tell you a little bit more about it. We come in every Sunday to open up the Bible. If you don't like a hard copy, go ahead and download one on your iPad or iPhone or smartphone of any type. In fact, you can follow along. As you heard Dave say, we are using the Bible app. You can go in there, and you can actually follow along with the slides in there and keep it for the week. You can put your notes in there. You can share it on Facebook. You can tell all your friends that you're here and you're reading the Bible. Because our desire is that we take this with us as we leave this place, that this isn't a one-time-a-week thing, that this is an all-week thing. So hopefully you have one of these and you're reading it all week long. We're going to look at Luke 6, 12 through 16 as our primary passage, and we have a secondary passage we're also going to look at. We're looking at somewhat of an obscure passage that may be very easy to pass over if you were just kind of reading it as you're going through Luke, but I think it's a passage that's very important that shows us Jesus' intentionality towards this thing, towards relationships. So begin with me, verse 12. One day, soon afterward, Jesus went up on a mountain to pray, and he prayed to God all night long. I want to pause right there. Read it again. One day soon afterward, Jesus went up on a mountain to pray, and he prayed to God all night long. So we say that relationships, or that living intentionally is about relationships. What's the most important relationship to begin with? It's right there. Jesus exhibits it for us. His relationship began here first, with himself and God first. For each of us, that's the very first relationship that we need to focus on in our lives. In fact, this last series here in January, we rolled out a new mission statement, helping people find new life in Christ here, near, and far by focusing on 4 priorities: pursue, connect, serve, reach. And we intentionally put pursue as the number one thing because that's where it begins. We have to have this relationship right first in order to have this relationship right second. And you see, Jesus, he went up on a mountaintop and he did what? He spent all night in prayer with God. Prayer was a big thing for Jesus. In fact, at some point, we're going to do a series on prayer. We're going to look at how much Jesus prayed. He spent a lot of time focused on this relationship. In fact, Luke highlights it a number of times. In 3:21, 5:16, 9:18, 9:28, and 11:1, he highlights the fact that Jesus focused on prayer. Well, why would Jesus have to focus on prayer? Why would he need to have this relationship right with God? Wasn't he God? Well, yes, he was. So what does that mean? Well, that's a great question. Come back after Easter. We're going to talk about it. We're going to be doing a series coming out of Easter where we're talking about the Trinity and the understanding of the relationship within the Trinity and how vital that is to us and how we must understand that. We're calling that series Why We Believe What We Believe. So come back for that. Because at some point, I do want to focus on why did Jesus pray? What was his relationship like with God? Why is that important to us? And we're going to talk about it. But rabbit trail, if that bothers you that I give lead-ins for future times to come, I'm sorry, but I'm going to keep doing it. How does that sound? In fact, I've worked with a number of individuals, and people have philosophy about what church should be, and where I stand is that hopefully we build off of 1 week into the next. Why? Because I want you to get excited to be here, right? So I'm going to give teasers for a really, really, really long time. Hopefully every week there will be a teaser that gets you to want to come back. So to help you when you're not here, because there's this Minnesota cabin culture, which will break someday, I promise you, we're installing a video camera tomorrow, actually. So we're going to be hopefully streaming our messages online as well as recording them so they'll be available. But you know what? That isn't near as good as being here in person, so come on Sundays. But our desire is that we study the Word together, that we move from one point to another, and that there's an excitement there. And so one of the exciting things is to talk about why would Jesus pray, which we'll do after Easter. But Luke talks about prayer because it was important, because in order to be able to do this, in order to be able to relate to others, you've got to be poured into first. In fact, in order for you to pour out, you have to be filled up. I can't pour out unless I'm filled up. And how do I get filled up? I have to be in right relationship with God. How many people have walked through life feeling empty before? I talk to people regularly about how their life is empty. In fact, I've talked to Christians many times. Oftentimes, people come to me, I'm just not where I should be. And you know the first question I ask them? What's your time like with God? You know how often I get this look? Ugh. It never fails. When I have conversations with individuals who don't feel like they're where they're supposed to be, all I have to ask is, what's your time like with God? Are you getting filled up? Because if you're not filled up, you can't pour out, and you can't walk through life empty. Because as we talk about pursue, connect, serve, reach, pursue is important because I can't connect, serve, and reach unless I've pursued first. Unless I'm filled up, I can't pour out, so I have to pursue in order to effectively be able to connect, serve, and reach, because if I'm not doing this, then what am I giving to others? What am I pouring out? And the likelihood is that if it's not spiritually based, if it's not grounded in Scripture, if it's not being poured in by God Himself, it's not worthwhile. Don't get me wrong. There's a lot of good worldly advice out there, right? There's a lot of good common sense. I've read some amazing statements by people that weren't Christians that are very helpful in life. But it's not the same, right? If God's not behind it, if it is not empowered by the Spirit, it's not going to change lives. It might help you create a list and accomplish a goal, but it's not going to change lives. What good is it, though, if I get poured in or if I get filled up, but I don't pour out? You ever filled up a pitcher of water and put it on a table and then not drank it? Does that make any sense? Because the flip side of it is I have to do this in order to do this, but if I only do this, then something's missing. Jesus exhibits that next. Verse 13. At daybreak, he called together all of his disciples and chose 12 of them to be apostles. Second focus for Jesus was then the pouring out. He was filled up, he poured out. He calls together this group of individuals. At daybreak, he called together all of his disciples and chose 12 of them to be his apostles. In this passage, you see a very strategic decision on behalf of Jesus. He calls his disciples together, a group that at that time could have been fairly large. He says, there's going to be a number of you that I'm going to call apostles because I know that in order to get everything done in this world that I need to get done, I can't do it myself. That was a pretty bold statement from the perfect likeness of God. That Jesus said that I need a group of you that are going to come together so that you can do what it is that I need you to do. He calls together his disciples, and I want to make a very clear separation here between the idea of disciples and apostles. So we're going to study a number of individuals in the series. There are going to be a number of people that Jesus has as disciples, but then there's these 12 that were his apostles. Today, you and I are Jesus' disciples. If you believe that Jesus Christ is your personal Lord and Savior, you are his disciple. But we are not apostles. This was a very special group of individuals that Jesus strategically chose because he knew that they were going to change the world. Who were they? Verse 14. Simon, whom he named Peter, Andrew, Peter's brother, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Simon, who was called the Zealot, Judas, son of James, Judas Iscariot, who later betrayed him. Point number 2 this morning, you need the right people around you. Jesus knew he needed people with him, but who were those people going to be? So he chose the right people. He chose perfectly. He chose 12 individuals that he knew were going to be the ones that were going to do exactly what it was that they needed to do. All 12 of them. He batted 1,000, which is really, really hard to do. I've been in leadership for almost 15 years now, and I can tell you that this is very, very, very important. In fact, this point right here is so important, we're going to expound on it next week, and that's going to be the topic of our message next week is who do you have around you? But having been in leadership, it's one of the things that you do, that you have to do regularly, is you have to interview, you have to put people around you, and you spend hours and hours and hours thinking about it, because having the right people near you is exactly what needs to happen to get the things done that need to get done. Jesus chose perfectly. You may be sitting there going, but wasn't the last part of that verse that there was one that betrayed him? Yep, that's exactly right. And we're going to talk about that in a sec. But he put these individuals around him because he knew that they had a purpose. Well, here's what's cool today is the exact same thing can be said about every single one of us. If Jesus was intentional with who he chose then, he's still intentional with who he chooses today. He puts the right people right where they're supposed to be at the right moment, and guess who that is? That's you. You're here today because you are exactly where you're supposed to be, because God has come and said, I have a purpose for you. And what's that purpose? To be intentional in your life. Towards what end? Relationships. The people around you should be the ones that you focus on, because I've chosen you to do that. If you read this list of individuals, this is an absolutely incredible list. These were the right people. Third thing we can see here then is that Jesus not only chose the right people, but he focused on a few, which can be kind of selective and hard for us at times to go, I don't know if I feel comfortable with that. And yet he knew that's exactly what he needed to do, that he couldn't focus on everybody, so he had to choose a few. So he chose 12. How would it have felt, I wonder, at the time if you were one of the disciples and Jesus is sitting there going, all right, I need 12 of you. Okay? Because it says very clearly here that he chose out of a group of individuals for 12. What if you weren't chosen? Would you have felt kind of bad? How would you have responded? What would that have been like? As I was studying, there were a number of passages that said that this was actually an expectation of individuals, rabbis. They'd have a group of people that would come along, and it wasn't that you weren't allowed to be in the group anymore, but the rabbi knew, based off of what he was trying to accomplish, that there was a select group of individuals that he needed to focus on. And this is exactly the same today. Focus on a few. In fact, Jesus then even broke it down to 3, Peter, James, and John. When Jesus went up into the Mount of Transfiguration, he took with him Peter, James, and John, Matthew 17:1. When he raised Jairus, daughter from the dead, Peter, James, and John were the only ones he allowed in the room, Mark 5:37. Jesus took these 3 with him deeper into the Garden of Gethsemane than he did any others, Mark 14:33. Why? Because the reality of life is that we're going to be intentional. We can only sustain so many relationships. When I worked for Target for a number of years, they had a number of individuals that could report to you because they knew if you got spread so thin, you couldn't focus on the individuals that were there with you. I think we live in a world today where we do that really, really well. We focus on a lot of people and get spread very thin. We don't do a good job of focusing on the few, the individuals that God has put in front of us, because there is pride in the fact that I have 5,000 friends on Facebook, or I have a social media network that is huge, or I have X amount of followers on my YouTube channel, which, how many people have, I don't know, little kids in here? Anybody want to tell me what this blind bag thing is all about? Can you, explain that to me? If you're not laughing right now, you don't have little kids. There is this thing on YouTube. There's 2 things, actually. There are videos that people watch of other people playing video games. That's actually a thing. And for some reason, my 6-year-old son really likes watching other people play Mario, which is crazy to me. And then there's this thing where there's these blind bags. There's these little toys that you open up. And there's these videos of individuals that literally open up boxes while other people watch them. And there are hundreds of thousands of people that do this. I don't get it. I don't understand it. And yet we get excited about things where there's thousands of people doing things that don't make sense, that we've never been connected to, and yet that's our culture. And so as we start YouTube channels, as we think about our Facebook friends, as we think about all that stuff, we want lots and lots of people to be involved. And yet how are we going to reach the individuals that are closest to us? Last week we talked about this in our priorities, Pursue, Connect, Serve, Reach, is that we have been uniquely gifted to reach a certain group of individuals and those that are directly around us. So who's around you right now? Who are you focusing on? Who are the few that you're pouring into like Jesus did? But fourth, at the same time, we can't neglect the many. Does that mean we forget about the crowds? No, not at all. In fact, at daybreak, he called together all of his disciples. Jesus had many, many people that were around him, individuals that he'd poured into, that he cared about, that he preached to. In fact, we see him preach to the multitudes over and over and over and over again. In fact, this is something that as churches we wrestled with regularly. Do I focus on this group, or do I continue to expand to this group? The answer is, to some degree, both. The first is that we got people around us. The second is then we need to expand that so others can see what it is that we're doing within that. It's called discipleship. I had an opportunity to be with a leadership consultant for a number of sessions, and we talked a lot about how do leaders lead as enterprises and organizations continue to get larger. And like we've seen in the church world, it's done by as you get bigger, you have to get smaller. And so there's this thing called life groups, small groups, where we have individuals that can pour into each other, at the same time being able to be larger. And yet that's the struggle that we have and the balance we have here as we continue to grow. This room's getting more and more full, and I've had many individuals ask, so how or when do we plan on going to 2 services? And my answer is not for a while. You're going to have to continue to get to know each other and sit close to each other and build friendships with the person next to you. Because the desire is to continue to grow, but as we grow, we got to do this. So I just want to jam everybody into this room, so you're just going to have to show up early to get a good seat. How does that sound? Because as the church grows, it has to get smaller. As any organization grows, it has to get smaller. And only then leaders can really only have so many individuals they can interact with. In fact, the magic number, as many people have studied, is, can anybody guess? 12. 12. That's actually like when the breaking point is 12. Each individual can only have 12 people they're pouring into before they get spread so thin that somebody gets left out. And within that, Jesus went to 3, and so he had this group of individuals. So how do we do that? We need those individuals around us, but we can't neglect the many. He did that. As we get closer together, we can't push people away. We can't not let other individuals into that. And so how do we balance that? Well, it's tough. But in our lives, we need to examine that. This leadership consultant that I met with, he talked about, as your church grows, as a church from 0 to 50, you need to know everybody in your church. You need to have relationships with a couple people, but you need to know everybody. 0 to 100, you need to know half of those people. And then you need to put 2 or 3 people around you. 100 to 300, you need to know 50 people, and then you need to have 10 people around you. 500 to 1,000, you need to know 25 people, and you need to have 8 people around you. And he had this formula. And yet often we try to extend ourselves so thin that we don't reach anybody. So I've got to be cognizant of that in my life. I've got to be an individual that makes sure that I have the right people around me, that I'm focused on the right individuals. But we also have to do that just like Jesus. And then we have to be intentional with our time. Are they with us? Are we pouring into them? What influence do we have on them? And how are we challenging them to be more like Jesus? Fifth, then, though, don't be surprised when we do get individuals together that some walk away. Don't be surprised when some walk away. Verse 16, Judas, son of James, Judas Iscariot, who later betrayed him. The tough part of relationships is the reality that in this life, people will walk away. In fact, that's one of the toughest things about being a pastor, and that's one of the scariest things about growing a church and getting to know people. Because the reality is, at some point, that person might walk away. In fact, I have talked to a number of pastors that will tell you, hands down, that is the hardest thing about being in ministry, is watching somebody walk away. Yet as parents, we can understand it, right? Maybe you're here today and you've got a child that has done that. Or maybe you're here today and you have a really, really, really close friend that has done that. They've walked away. Jesus wasn't even immune to that. He had one that betrayed him, that turned his back on him, and others that walked away. John 6, 60 through 69 says this. John chapter 6, 60 through 69. On hearing it, many of his disciples said, "This is a hard teaching. Who can accept it?" Jesus said that I am the sustenance. I am the life. I am the way that you will get what it is that you're looking for. I am salvation. And on hearing this, many of his disciples said, "This is a hard teaching. Who can accept it?" Now, remember, disciples, apostles, many of his disciples, those that were following him, aware that his disciples were grumbling about this, not his apostles, his disciples, Jesus said to them, "Does this offend you? Then what if you see the Son of Man ascend to where he was before? The Spirit gives life, the flesh counts for nothing. The words I have spoken to you, they are full of the Spirit and of life. Yet there are some of you who do not believe." For Jesus had known from the beginning which one of them or which of them did not believe and who would betray him. He went on to say, "This is why I told you that no one can come to me unless the Father has enabled them." From this time, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. "You do not want to leave too, do you?" Jesus asked the 12. This is where he's speaking to his apostles now. Simon Peter answered him, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and know you are the Holy One of God." See, there will be times when Jesus, even in Jesus' life, where people walked away. And yet even in that, he was completely intentional. But he knew his people in a way that we can't know the people around us, and yet he interacted with them to do one thing. What? He pointed them to himself and said, if you're going to walk away, it's going to be for one reason, and that's me. Because I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life, I am the sustenance. And so I'm here today to say if people walk away, why are they walking away? Is it because we pointed them to Jesus? Because that's the only reason they should walk away. So if we point people to him, and that's where the hardship and the rub comes, then we got to be okay with that. Why do I say that? Because Jesus understood that that's exactly what would happen. In fact, when I said that he picked 12 and every single one of them were intentional and every single one of them were purposeful, it's because he knew that even when they walked away, God had a plan for that. Because why did he pick Judas? He had to pick Judas. Judas had to be a part of his group. Why? Because Jesus had to die. Jesus had to be betrayed. He had to have somebody in his midst that would know exactly where he was at just the right time so that he could tell the individuals where they needed to be, where they needed to go to find him so that he could save us. He had to die. He had to be betrayed. He intentionally chose Judas for a reason. Like I said, we don't know the people around us, and hopefully we don't choose individuals that will betray us because I don't want to die. At least not right now. I mean, I got a little life left. 2022, here we come. But what gives hope to us in this passage is that even when they do walk away, God still has a plan. I have an opportunity just in the last number of months being here in the community, and this is, for some of us, a hard topic. But there have been a number of people that have left New Life Church. And it always hasn't been the best situation. You know what's been really, really cool as I've been in this community? That God had a plan for that. Because there are many churches in Woodbury that have been blessed by individuals from this church that have gone out to love people in a way that they never would have if they'd stayed here. And Woodbury is thriving spiritually because of the impact that New Life had, and yet here's where the rub is sometimes. It always wasn't done intentionally. So what if we did that? What if we sent people out? What if we challenged people to go intentionally to make a difference in the name of Jesus because we cared about the relationships that were around us? And we brought people around us and said, I have a plan for you because I know you can do something, because if you stay here with me, if you know who Jesus is, if you know what he's all about, if you understand what he's done, that when you leave this place, you can change the world, because that's point number 6. Those that stayed, they changed the world. Those that stayed with Jesus, Simon, Andrew, Simon who became Peter, Andrew who was Peter's brother, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Simon who was called the Zealot, Judas, son of James, and even Judas Iscariot who later betrayed him. They changed the world. I've seen this over and over and over again, but what I can tell you is it doesn't happen tomorrow. And there's been a number of things that have happened over the last number of years, even with myself included, where God has sent people in places that they never intended to be for purposes that they never understood because God has a plan in that. And what is that plan? To reach individuals with his message so he can change the world through us. And that is exciting. But that takes time, and it takes something very clear. It takes intentionality. We have to be intentional. We have to be filled up so we can pour out, so we can challenge each other to go where it is that God has us so that we can change the world. And we've seen that happen here at New Life. We've seen those that have left make an impact, and we've seen those that have stayed continue to make an impact. I mean, Matt Engstrom is the chairman of our elder board right now. Who would have thought of that 20 years ago? And yet he stayed. And he changed my world. Because I'm here today challenging each one of us to do the exact same thing. Because he was obedient, God chose him, even when he wasn't one of the individuals sitting there going, hey, can I be one of the 12? He told everybody, I don't want to be one of the 12. Don't pick me. Don't tell me that I'm going to do this. Don't offer me this opportunity because I don't want anything to do with it. And God said, too bad, buddy. I got a plan for you. And your plan isn't even actually about you. Your plan's about somebody else, who then's going to impact somebody else, who's then going to impact somebody else because I'm changing the world. And oh, by the way, I happen to use you. And yet he's knocking it out of the park, crushing it because he stayed. So how about you? Where are you at? What's going on in your life? Who do you have around you? How are you being challenged? How are you being filled up so you can pour out? Who are you pouring into? And 20 years from now, what are we going to say about that relationship? I can look back at my life over and over and over and over and over again, the right people, the right time, in the right place. And I can tell you that all the lists that I set and all the goals that I accomplished meant nothing if it hadn't been for the people that were around me. For the last number of weeks, we've had a number of individuals, or a couple individuals here in the church, pass away. We've had people that have been there, and I've had the opportunity to been with a couple of them, and I've been in a number of those situations where I tell you, when you get to the end of your life, you don't talk about the stuff or the goals that you accomplished. You talk about the people that were there. You talk about the memories, the relationships that you built. In fact, for many of us, if we have the pleasure of getting to the end of our lives at a very old age, all of life is brought to one room, in one bed, with one dresser, and a lot of pictures. Who's in those pictures? Who are the people that are around you? Who are you today intentionally surrounding yourself with? Because that's our challenge. And the beauty of it is that it can't start too early, and it can't start too late. It starts right now. Because until the day we wake up where we're not breathing, we have a job to do. We have a responsibility. And I can't wait to see what God does. 20 years from now, who's the next Matt Engstrom? Who's the next Billy Graham? They might be here. They might be in these seats right now. And God might be challenging you to be that person. It starts by pursuing God every day. Because he pursued us, wants us in relationship with him, so he can use us to change the world.